cancer treatment, and we won. We sued a drug company that was trying to monopolize the market for a drug to treat Pompe's disease, which kills infants before their first birthday, and we won. And we also stopped what would have been the single largest grocery store merger in this country that would have raised prices and lowered wages for thousands or millions of consumers and thousands upon thousands of workers across the country. And yet now, 2 months into his administration, President Trump sent a letter via one of his staff yesterday purporting to illegally fire him. Now, I think a lot of folks have heard this news and have naturally, wanted to talk about what happened to me or what happened to my colleague, Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter. Or perhaps they talked about it in terms of the laws that were being violated, the precedents that were being broken, how the Supreme Court's will was being undone. But I think that what we really need to do is focus on something else, someone else. I think we need to be focused on the billionaires over President Trump's shoulder at his inauguration and what this attempt will do for them. Because I think above all else, we need to be asking ourselves, who will win from this attempt to illegally remove us? And frankly, who will lose? Over the president's shoulders, as you know, at the inauguration, were the 3 richest men on the planet. Mr. Elon Musk, who runs, among many other companies, the social media site X. Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, who runs the social media site Meta, Facebook, and Instagram, as well as Mr. Jeff Bezos, the, I believe now, chairman of Amazon. Each of those men and each of their companies is currently the subject of an FTC court order or is currently the subject of FTC litigation. I am sitting as a judge in a manner in which FTC staff is trying to tighten and ramp up the privacy protections for Meta users. I am responsible for enforcing a 20-year privacy consent decree against the company most of us know as Twitter. And I am suing Amazon, Mr. Bezos' company, in not one, but 2 separate lawsuits. So I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, who will win from this effort to remove us? Is it going to be regular people struggling to make rent? Is it going to be regular people seeing higher and higher grocery bills? Or is it going to be billionaires? Now, I think sometimes when you talk about technology, it can be a little hard to connect down to this core question in the hearing before you today, which is affordability. Are folks' ability to pay their rent, to pay their bills, to have decent health care that will help them stay afloat? And so let's talk about that. As many of you know, I mentioned what many of you may know is the Kroger-Albertsons merger, the attempted Kroger-Albertsons merger. This was a $24 billion merger that in thousands of towns across the country would have taken the biggest supermarket in town and merged it with the next biggest supermarket. Now, you don't need to be a PhD in economics to know what that's going to do to grocery prices, and you don't need to have a PhD in economics to know what that's going to do to the wages of the workers that work in those stores. And yet, indeed, we saw Kroger executives testify under oath to marking up the price of milk and eggs above inflation in the period after the pandemic. We had union leaders testify that if these 2 companies were allowed to merge, they would not be able to negotiate for higher wages by simply pointing to the supermarket down the street and say, they're doing it better. And so, and the thing I want to stress is that while that merger was, it was public news that was being investigated, you would not believe the political pressure that elected officials tried to impose on us. Now, many of them were saying we got to block the merger, but others, frankly, including some prominent Democrats, said you should let this merger proceed. And yet we went ahead and blocked it because we determined it would raise prices on people and lower wages. We sued Attorney General Phil Weiser of Colorado, also sued in Colorado, and we won. We were able to successfully block that merger. So why am I talking about that today in 2025? Because I'm thinking about the next mega merger that's going to come down the pike. And I'm worried that it's not going to matter if it's going to raise prices on consumers. It's not going to matter if it's going to lower the wages of the workers, the people who work in the I'm worried that the only thing that's going to matter are which billionaire has the president's ear on this deal and what strings can be pulled about it. I am profoundly worried that the only thing that's going to matter with respect to these mergers is not the law, but the money. Who has it and who can make it move around, who can move it around and exercise the power that it brings to their benefit. And so this, frankly, is where we come to your role. Because when I look forward to the next 4 years of consumer protection and antitrust enforcement, I don't know what it will bring here at Washington. But I do know that irrespective of what happens here in Washington, you in Colorado have a singular role to play in protecting consumers, small businesses, and workers. Just look at the law enforcement track record, whether it comes to accessing low prices for generics and suing to guarantee that, whether it comes down to suing the manufacturers of Suboxone, a key drug in the fight against opiate addiction, whether it comes to suing to try to stop the T-Mobile and Sprint merger. Litigators in Colorado and in state capitals across the country have a track record of leading before federal law enforcers act, and frankly, moving ahead to contest some of these mergers, like the T-Mobile and Sprint merger, when federal law enforcers do not want to act. But here's the key thing. This is not just about law enforcers. This is also about you as legislators and your unique ability to step up and ensure that Colorado isn't just in the middle of the path, but is in the forefront of enacting the strongest protections possible for consumers, for small businesses, and workers that will promote affordability, provide them a level playing field, and help them stay afloat. Let me give you 3 quick examples, and Chair Gonzalez, I will pause for comments and questions that I need to hear from members of the Joint Committee. First, I want to talk about junk fees. Imagine you are looking for rental housing, and you see a pretty good price online for a new apartment. You start the process of maybe filling out a lease application. Maybe you actually sign a lease application. In between the time you see that upfront price and the time you see your first rent bill, something funny starts to happen. New fees start popping up. Mandatory fees for things you have never heard of. Apparently, you have to pay a special utility surcharge for the utilities not in your apartment, but in the common areas of the building in which you're in. Apparently, you have to pay a special fee to make sure there aren't cockroaches running through that building and other pests. Apparently, you have to pay a special fee just to make sure that the packages that arrive at the front door of your building actually make it to your home. Now, some of you may know, none of this is a hypothetical. Right now, the FTC is suing, alongside Attorney General Phil Weiser, Greystar, which is one of the largest providers, if not the largest provider in many markets of rental units for families. And one thing that I think is critical to understand is that, number one, these fees aren't small. These hidden junk fees can add up to hundreds of dollars a year that consumers do not see in that upfront price. Number two, these investigations, while important, especially important when you're targeting a massive company like Greystar, they're worthwhile. But unfortunately, sometimes they can be whack-a-mole. Because if you shut down one operation, you stop a certain set of conduct, another company starts doing it tomorrow. That is why it's so important that we have rules on the books that outright ban these kinds of hidden junk fees. And I am thrilled that the Colorado legislature has before it just such a bill, House Bill 25-1090, that would prohibit these kinds of hidden junk fees, including in residential housing. And I will respectfully say that if you succeed in passing this bill, you will go even further than the Federal Trade Commission did in prohibiting junk fees for live events and travel. I urge you to take up that bill and pass it. Now let's turn to labor. As many of you know, workers in our country are facing shameful conditions. It is shameful that workers, even with so-called good health care plans, have to go online and fundraise for their own cancer treatments. It is shameful that new mothers are often sent back to work weeks or even days after giving birth to a child. It is shameful that workers in companies run by billionaires go to the shop floor wearing diapers because they are denied the the time it takes to go to the bathroom. It is shameful that so many of those workers are injured. Their hands stop working. They tear their rotator cuffs. The discs in their backs bulge and break. This is shameful. Consistently, in the research, the one factor that is shown to improve wages, improve working conditions, improve benefits is unionization in that workplace. It also is proven to show to improve safety in those workplaces. As I believe all of you know, in 49 states, workers only have to win one vote in order to get their due. But in Colorado, they have to win two. And that second vote, I believe, is a supermajority vote that may require up to 3/4 of the workers to ratify. You have before you the Worker Protection Act. And my hope is that the Colorado legislature passes it and that Governor Polis signs it and brings Colorado into the same level of protection for its workers as the rest of the country. But I want to close on one final bill, which, like the first bill I mentioned about hidden junk fees, is an opportunity for Coloradans to lead the way when it comes to anti-monopoly and consumer protection. And that is House Bill 25-1264, which is a bill that would bar certain kinds of algorithmic decisions that set wages for workers and prices for consumers. Just 2 hours ago, I was meeting virtually with a room full of rideshare drivers right there in Denver, Colorado. I suspect some of them may be in the hearing room today. I heard from them what I heard from rideshare drivers in California, rideshare drivers in New York. We don't know why we're paying what we're paying. We have no insight into that, and we strongly suspect that we are being given different prices based on things that have nothing to do with our skills as drivers. House Bill 25-1264 does something simple. It bans that practice. It requires that any differentiation in wages be tied to the actual performance of that job and not completely different attributes of those workers or the way they use the apps that have nothing to do with their skills as drivers. It also would ban similar kinds of surveillance pricing for consumers. The FTC recently issued a request for information around the use of surveillance pricing, actually manipulating the prices of products, say, in a grocery store, based on the characteristics of those consumers. Our new chairman, Adrian Ferguson, decided to close that comment docket, but a few comments survived. And some of the most startling comments involve consumers literally going to the grocery store, friends, family members, with smartphones open in each of their hands and seeing how one of them was consistently offered a higher price for the same product for reasons they know not why. This kind of legislation would move Colorado to the forefront of consumer protection, and I urge you to pass it. So in closing, I'll just reiterate, we do not know what's going to happen in Washington. I hope that the lawsuit that I and Commissioner Slaughter will file will be successful, and it will be perfectly clear that we remain commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission. But regardless of what happens, you in Colorado are leading the way. Governor Polis has a chance to lead the way by signing the Worker Protection Act, and you have the ability to make Colorado the leader when it comes to banning junk fees in residential housing and banning algorithmic pricing for consumers and algorithmic wages for workers. And I so hope that Colorado takes up this charge and moves ahead with those actions. With that, I want to say thank you to Chair Gonzalez, thank you all, thank you, Chair McNay, thank you, members of the committee. I'd be glad to answer your questions and simply hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your comments. I want to open it up for questions, and as I open it up for questions, I want to ensure that there are as many questions as we can field in as much time as we have together. We have about 20 minutes for questions. And so if you have a question, I'll invite you to raise your hand so that we can get you in the queue. I want to give parity in the questioning between Democrats in the committee and Republicans. And so with that, I will invite you all to raise your hands and we will start the queue. I'll begin with Mr. Vice Chair, Representative Mabry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Bedoya, for being here today. The first thing that I want to note is one of the elementary cases we learned on separation of powers is Humphrey's executor, and it's about the firing of somebody who worked on the FTC. And so I agree with you that the law is very clear that your firing is illegitimate. My first question, and I'm going to ask my second question right after. My first question is, why do you think you were fired? My second question has to do with the junk fee bill. As you know, Sam Levine sent us in Colorado a letter about junk fees, and as this legislation is moving through the process, industry is asking us to remove the private right of action, raising concerns that the private right of action is too detrimental. Can you talk about the impact that removing the private right of action will have on the effectiveness of our ability to protect Colorado consumers?
Commissioner Bedoya.
Thank you, Chairman Bree, and thank you, Chair Gonzalez. Let me answer both of those questions. I'll start with the private right of action. I absolutely think a private right of action is critical, and let me tell you why. Right now, federal law enforcement agencies are facing extraordinary budget pressures. Standard budget pressures and also the budget pressures imposed by DOGE, which is entering a lot of these agencies and cutting contracts. And so what happens when you're a law enforcer is you have to prioritize. And so oftentimes what will happen is crimes and civil offenses in which people are hurt, people physically hurt, people, there is a large-scale, almost criminal level of fraud naturally rise to the top. And so some of these more subtle ways, I absolutely think of defrauding people, don't rise to the top of that. Now that changed under Chair Lee Khan. We were able to bring in any number of junk fees cases, but that's not standard conduct. What the private right of action does is it allows individual consumers to have their day in court to contest these hidden junk fees, separate and apart from whether a state or a federal law enforcer has the ability to prioritize their case. To answer your first question, I don't know why the president is trying to fire me. I do think it is very interesting that I was not fired in week 1 or week 2 of the administration, when it seemed like there were a bunch of names on a list that were intended to be fired to achieve some kind of unitary executive. I think it's interesting that the last public statement I made was critical of one of the men standing behind the president's shoulder at his inauguration. I issued a statement criticizing Mr. Bezos for working his people in warehouses so fast, so hard, that they literally have to put up vending machines on the warehouse floor, dispensing and capping the amount of painkillers each of those workers has to get. Senator Sanders just wrote a major expose on this. I also, would be remiss if I didn't restate that I'm suing Amazon right now in federal court for tricking consumers into subscriptions they do not want and cheating small businesses, forcing small businesses to pay up to 50 cents of every dollar they make to Amazon. These are small business owners. You can't be a small business retailer and not be on Amazon. It is a monopolist. The other thing Amazon did was prevent the small business retailers on the site from offering consumers lower prices off that platform. And so I'm not alleging that this was why I was fired, but I think it's an interesting coincidence.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Bedoya, for the response. I want to make sure and see if there are any questions from the Republican members for Commissioner Bedoya. Seeing no questions at this time, I'll move on in the queue to Representative Zakai.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Bedoya, for spending some time with us this afternoon. It is great to hear your remarks, and disappointed to hear about your illegal firing. I do think it violates plain language of statute and Supreme Court precedent, so I am curious if you are planning to fight it. I also wanted to ask you about the consolidation of corporate power that we are seeing across this country. I'm very concerned about the monopolization of America, and we have antitrust laws that you have successfully used to stop some of these mergers, but it's not always easy to enforce those antitrust laws. one of the things that I looked into was that overlap between price fixing and price gouging, and seeing if we could strengthen price gouging laws in the state to be able to hold those bad actors accountable. I'm curious your thoughts on that, and also if there are other avenues of protections that we can increase in our state to try to prevent some of these actions.
Commissioner
Absolutely.
Bedoya.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Let me first talk about price gouging and then zoom out a little bit. Because I think you were gesturing at some bigger issues about how monopolization affects this country. And respectfully, I think it's really important that this not be an issue of Democrats versus Republicans, and I want to talk about that. But first, let's talk about price gouging. As I mentioned, in the Kroger-Albertsons merger, there came out testimony during trial that showed the pricing executive, the key pricing executive at Kroger, looking at the rate of inflation and then marking up the price of eggs and milk above that. And one of the interesting debates that happened during the pandemic was that a lot of critics started saying, hey, the prices we're seeing at the grocery store don't have to do with inflation. It has to do with monopolists and other powerful market actors realizing that they can blame price increases on inflation and using that to gouge consumers. And so, one of the bills I understand before the legislature is a bill to prohibit marking up the cost of essential goods. I believe it was more than 10% during an emergency, and I think that's a terrific proposal. One thing I want to speak directly to is, yes, I am a Democratic commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission, but I frankly, in 2025, don't think of this as a D or R or a blue or red issue. I have spent most of my time as a commissioner in rural America, in places like West Virginia, Tennessee, South Dakota, Utah, Oklahoma, meeting with the small retailers, the independent grocers, the independent pharmacists that serve rural America. And those folks are getting screwed. Those folks are getting screwed in the prices they can access, in the playing field they can access. And the people who are hurt the most by this, I would say 9 times out of 10, but frankly, the majority of the time, are rural, working class people. One of the cases we filed right before the end of the last administration was a case against John Deere, which was basically, we allege, locking down their software so that if you need to fix your tractor, you can't fix it on your ranch, on your farm, you can't fix it at the shop down the street you've used for generations, you got to take it into the dealership. And so we allege this with competitive conduct. That is in federal court today. And lastly, I want to stress an uncomfortable fact, which is that the issue of the corrupting influence of money in politics, I don't think is limited to one party. In the last election, you had an instance where Chair Khan, the vice president, refused to name Chair Khan as the next chair of the Federal Trade Commission, that she would keep her as chair of the Federal Trade Commission. And frankly, I think that has more than anything to do with the amount of money and big money donors that we're giving to her campaign, such that, Chair Khan's policies were wildly popular in rural America, urban America, suburban America, red, blue, you name it. The Vice President Vance is a big supporter of her work, and yet the Vice President Harris, wouldn't agree to have her be her FTC chair. And so this issue of the corrupting influence of billionaires and law enforcement is an issue that affects all of us, regardless of party, regardless of where we live.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. I'd like to see if there's any other hands for the queue at this point. Representative Sober.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, former Commissioner Bedoya, for being here today. I did just want to ask, as I was listening to your remarks today, certainly you named a bunch of lawsuits, and we're talking about lowering prices, or at least trying to control prices the best that we can to keep America affordable. But yet, lawsuits are one reason why prices are driven up, and certainly major lawsuits that a company has to defend also has that result of increasing prices, and wondered what your thoughts would be to that.
Commissioner Bedoya.
Absolutely, and look, I'm sympathetic to the fact that litigation costs money. If you're a small business and you're facing a lawsuit, that is, and I'm deeply sympathetic to that. I think that what I've seen is instances where billion-dollar companies are jacking up the price of fixing your tractor, are trying to corner the market on a life-saving cancer drug, are trying to corner the market on, or two hospitals trying to merge. And I think that in antitrust, of course there are instances where there's litigation that is intended to harass and intimidate people. That is sadly a fact of life. But I think when it comes to antitrust and consumer protection, there's a real opportunity for targeted lawsuits to make a huge difference in the lives of consumers, small businesses, and workers. Millions of consumers, small businesses, and workers at a time in many instances.
Thank you. Our last question, I will turn to Representative Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think what we've seen, and you alluded to this in your opening, what we've seen is a lot of these changes, a lot of these lawsuits that you've had to take on, a lot of the decisions that have been made by Musk and Trump are really leaning towards wanting to ensure that those billionaires that he's stacking in his cabinet are really just aiming to make more money than they already have, while then using the rhetoric that, well, we're trying to protect workers, we're trying to protect consumers, and essentially pitting consumers against workers or small business against workers. And I'm just curious if you might be able to respond to that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. This is a refrain you hear all the time. That you got, rob Peter to pay Paul. I'm sure I'm butchering that metaphor. Let me give you two really concrete examples of how this is a false dichotomy, how this is not a zero-sum game. One historical, one modern. And let me start with the modern because I've talked about it. One thing we saw in the Kroger-Albertsons merger is a very clear evidentiary and testimonial record that blocking this merger would result both in lower prices to consumers and higher wages for workers. We had strong support from consumer groups and strong support from labor unions to block that merger. And so, right there, the people advocating for both of those constituencies did not see it as a conflict. But let me offer what I think is an even cleaner example that has to do with the beef trust. I think there's some ranching in Colorado in the Midwest. The beef trust was this conglomerate of 4 meat packers based in Chicago that basically controlled the market, ordered the market on what was then known as packed beef, right? Packaged and processed beef, as well as pork and other kinds of meat. And the thing you saw with the meat packers is they put themselves in the middle. And so all these ranchers from all across the West were putting their cattle on cattle cars and sending them to Chicago or to subsidiaries of the beef trust elsewhere in the country. And because of the power that this trust had, the trust set the price of beef. And when you have one place you can send your cattle to be processed, you better believe that the price they offer is the price you have to take. And so cattlemen and ranchers were seeing pennies on the dollar in terms of the product they were sending into the system. But then the consumers on the other side were not just paying high prices for the beef they bought, at the stores of that era. They were also seeing adulterated goods because they had no other places where they could buy their packed beef, their processed meats. And so you were seeing all sorts of chemicals being added, all sorts of fillers, sometimes sawdust was added to meats. And so this, I think, is the clearest historical example of how monopoly works. A monopolist will put themselves in the middle, act as a gatekeeper, charge rents to the suppliers that drive down the price they get, and charge those rents in terms of high prices to the consumers that they serve. And so I think defeating monopolies is a win to producers, farmers, ranchers, and other sorts of suppliers and other small retailers that feed into the system, and it's absolutely a win to consumers who are going to see lower prices as well. And if you look at the history of antitrust in this country, the people who passed these laws, Republicans, led by Republicans as well as Democrats, were absolutely concerned with both of these folks, small businesses and consumers alike.
Thank you, Commissioner Bedoya. As we approach the end of our time together, I do just want to extend once again our gratitude for your service. to American consumers here in Colorado and across the country. We appreciate the work that you are doing and have done to serve as the watchguard. That work is important, and I think that we all understand and recognize the important role that we as state legislatures and legislators have to play. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much. I will be in Denver this Friday. I'll be speaking at Senator Sanders' rally, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay. All right. With that, thank you again for joining. Feel free to stick around if you want to listen as we welcome Seth Frotman, former General Counsel and Senior Advisor from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Welcome to our joint Judiciary Committee hearing. There is a little gray button on the neck of your microphone. There you go. We will invite you to share your remarks, your introductory remarks with us, and then after that point, we will open up for questions from members of the committee. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Chairman Gonzalez, Chairman Mabry, and members of the committees. My name is Seth Frotman. I'm currently a senior fellow at Towards Justice, and until about a month ago, I was General Counsel and Senior Advisor to Director Rohit Chopra at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The CFPB was created by Congress nearly 14 years ago as the most direct response to the 2008 financial crisis and the rampant fraud that caused it, decimating communities here in Colorado and across our country, and precipitating a global recession on a scale not seen in generations. Since that time, the CFPB has been a lifeline for working families, a watchdog they could turn to when they got cheated by banks, student lenders, debt collectors, credit reporting agencies, and all the financial service providers that everyday Americans are forced to deal with, because that is the only way that they could put a roof over their families' heads, or send their kids to college, or just make their way through the day, given how financial products and trillions of dollars of consumer debt have grown ever more ubiquitous. The CFPB fights on behalf of American families to make sure they don't get ripped off, and it conducts vigilant oversight of risky financial products so that a similar crisis never happens again. I know that there are so many deeply disturbing events emanating almost every hour out of Washington that it is easy to lose track or turn away. So I think it is important to recount where we find ourselves. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Russell Vought have ignored Congress's directives and illegally shut down the CFPB. The inspectors who were spread out across the country, making sure that companies follow the law, were sent home and told not to work. The complaint system that helped people get answers when their bank gave them the runaround has been broken. The offices tasked by Congress to look after students, older Americans, and military families were told to stand down. The signs were literally torn off the building, and the people who stood between Colorado families and companies ripping them off were told they could pick up their personal items in 15-minute intervals at a loading dock. The work the CFPB was doing to make life more affordable for working families has been halted or destroyed. From cracking down on junk fees that make it impossible to comparison shop for what's most affordable for your family, to tackling the anti-competitive practices that facilitate soaring credit card rates, to removing barriers and spiraling costs in the housing market by taking on shaky tenant screening reports and mounting mortgage fees. Day after day, we see the current leaders of the CFPB literally taking money from working people and giving it to the rich. They have permanently dropped nearly a dozen enforcement actions where the CFPB was fighting to get back billions of dollars that large corporations and executives stole from everyday people. Big banks that trick their customers out of interest on deposits in their savings accounts. Student loan companies that collected on discharged debt. Shady lenders who put new spins on age-old loan sharking schemes. The list goes on and on. Now that these cases have been dropped, people may never see the return of their hard-earned money. which could have been used to pay for groceries, or a car, or help to cover rent. We are witnessing shameless pardon after shameless pardon for corporate malfeasance. In a sad summation of where we find ourselves, at a judicial hearing just a few weeks ago, a federal judge asked a lawyer representing the current CFPB director if protecting consumers from unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices is a policy of the Trump administration. And I kid you not, the attorney from the United States Department of Justice said he did not know. The CFPB is just one agency, and what is going on there is just one of the parade of horribles for everyday working people. Agency after agency has been disrupted and dismantled, from those that protect us from nuclear explosions to those that protect us from exploding mortgages. Any institution that provides a check against big banks or big tech or billionaires is on the list. Just yesterday, in a brazenly illegal act, the president purported to fire 2 FTC commissioners for standing up for workers and small-town grocers and pharmacists, and all of the regular people this administration drips with disdain for. This has nothing to do with efficiency, and it has nothing to do with affordability. It is clear what is happening in Washington right now will do nothing to make people's lives better or easier. So where does that leave us? The lawlessness that the Trump administration is stoking, and the abuse of everyday people that continues to rain down on so many, can be counteracted at least in part by ensuring that states have comprehensive, powerful laws and enforcement mechanisms to protect their citizens. Today's hearing is about affordability. To me, that translates into questions like, how do we make working people's lives in this state a little easier, a little cheaper? How do we ensure that people aren't taken advantage of when they buy the things they need? How do we ensure that markets are transparent so that firms compete on price and quality instead of tricks and traps buried in fine print? And what should a state do when the federal government seems hell-bent on ensuring the exact opposite? One of the reasons that people feel like they are constantly pushing a boulder up the hill is that too many companies' core business model is built on pushing that boulder down. We have seen healthcare providers steer people into inherently deceptive and usurious credit cards loaded with dead time bombs. We have seen unscrupulous landlords charge fees to pay for an apartment that's already been promised to someone else, or to simply pay rent, or for running water. We have seen big money startups imposing interest of 300% or more, just so people can get money they've already earned a little bit faster. Prices go down when innovative companies compete for customers in fair and transparent markets. Instead, people too often face a barrage of back-end pricing, junk fees, illegally manipulated lead generation sites, dark patterns, dubious subscription models, usurious lending products, private equity's ever more dubious way to extract water from a stone, and companies abusing their market power to increase prices across the board. The list goes on and on. Companies' unscrupulous practices drive up costs for working families and ensure already short paychecks run out before the month comes. Americans know intuitively that these practices contribute significantly to the crisis of affordability, and they are right. Their elected officials need to catch up. We will not solve the affordability crisis that so many families find themselves in today without being clear-eyed about these abuses, and without a government equipped with the tools and capabilities to do aggressive enforcement in response. If everyday people are going to enjoy the benefits of an abundant society, if things are actually going to become affordable for them, we will need expanded and vigilantly enforced protections against unfair dealing and unfair methods of competition. It is not affordable or abundant when people are targeted with junk fees that steal the last dollar in their bank account or force them to pay every time they put money on their kids' school lunch card. It is not abundant or affordable when online platforms peddle high-cost loans, squeeze out extra fees, and design elaborate kickback schemes to prey on the small businesses on their site, while spying on every movement of the people who stock their warehouses. It is not abundant or affordable when large corporations use surveillance pricing and algorithmic wage setting to charge as much as they possibly can while paying their workers as little as the black box says they can. In the age of big tech, gigantic Wall Street banks, and ever-growing monopolies, we need law enforcement and regulators at all levels, but especially now in states such as this one, to be equipped with ample tools and resources to actually stand up for people. Government should be a check against the cavalcade of companies that tack on ever more creative junk fees, a check on a mentality that laws are suggestions for people who prefer to move fast and break things, a check on the mindset that every pain point for working families is a possibility to seek leverage and supercharge profit margins. So yes, we should all embrace a discussion of what is working in government and what isn't. It was never lost on us at the CFPB that our building, formerly housed an agency, that failed so catastrophically that Congress shut it down. But that discussion must necessarily include how to ensure that our consumer protection laws are strong enough and deployed vigorously enough to deal forcefully with the many risks and threats that people face today. Our antitrust enforcers must be equipped with powerful tools to confront big tech, big ag, and big everything else. Our financial regulators must be able to deal with a world where everybody wants to be a bank and social media companies race to become payment super apps. Our government must have the tools and resolve to stand up for working people, regardless of who is trying to push the boulder back down on them and how they're trying to do it. That is why this hearing and your work is so tremendously important. This is a conversation we must kick off not just in Colorado, but nationwide. Because that is the only way we truly tackle affordability, the only sensible way to think about abundance, the only path to chart an alternative to the chaos and lawlessness oozing out of Washington. Government must be strong and capable enough to make markets work for people. That means being able to deliver protection from corporate abuse alongside building houses and infrastructure. We need both. I fear anything else does a disservice to those it purports to help and risks continuing the same fake promises we see coming out of Washington today. Thank you again for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Mr. Frotman, thank you for your comments and for your insights. I'd like to, again, see what questions members of the committee may have for Mr. Frotman, and I will begin with Senator Weissman.
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you for being here. Madam Chair, I have a little compound question. I'll try to state it quickly. Sir, as you alluded to, since 1914, I think, federal law has essentially said the following: unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce and unfair or deceptive acts or practices are hereby declared unlawful. Again, that law is more than 100 years old in our country. Would love to hear you summarize again for us, both as to who we would now call a consumer, but also as to business, as to the stream of commerce. Why? Why do we prohibit those acts? Relatedly, in federal enforcement, are you aware of any requirement that it be proven that some arbitrarily large number of folks have already been hurt, 500,000, 5,000, who knows, before there's any inquiry into the question of consequences for deceptive conduct? Moving to the state level, what is your understanding of how prevalent or not such a requirement of significant proof of widespread public impact before there can be any remedy is or isn't in the states? And then, particularly given, because as you noted, the president has effectively said you're fired to the entirety of CFPB, what's the consequence to consumers in a jurisdiction that continues to have that significant public impact rule or barrier?
Thank you so much, and thank you for the question. So, those who thought about the best way to deal with ensuring that we had fair and transparent marketplaces realized that if they were to go and list 20 things that were illegal, the next day someone would come up with the 21st. So what they did was create broad protections against companies engaged in unfair, deceptive, and in the Bureau's case, abusive acts or practices. And the idea was we need to be constantly vigilant to ensure when there's new technologies or new players or new markets, people are treated fair and honest businesses are able to compete. And I just wanted to focus on something that the Commissioner said that I think is really important, that I've seen in more than my nearly decade at the CFPB, is a lot of our work and is highlighted by what we do for consumers. But what we do is also to make sure that honest businesses have a level playing field. That if you're offering a product at a fair price without tricks and traps, you're able to compete in that marketplace. One of my best friends at early days at the Bureau talked about how his dad was a mortgage originator in the run-up to the great financial crisis. And he refused to make these no-income, no-document loans. And he talked about how hard it was for their family. When you see in the movies, this was a time when mortgage brokers were buying big mansions. When honest people were refusing to make those loans, they couldn't compete. And that is the premise of the Bureau's work and the state's work premise on prohibiting unfair practice, is to make sure consumers are protected and to make sure that honest businesses have a level playing field. One of the things that we have seen is this has become more important than ever. There are so many risks to consumers that I saw in my job that I think you heard the Commissioner talk about. Whether that's new risks when it comes to big technology entering consumer finance and so many other markets. Whether those are risks around privacy, data capture, data monetization, the targeting of people at their most vulnerable moments. These are all things where we need law enforcement officials at the federal level and the state level nimble enough to be able to stop, nimble enough to be able to protect their citizens. One of the things that we saw at the federal level when we would work with states is, unfortunately, claims that we could bring were somehow limited by state law. So we had a lot of conversation with states where we would talk to them about, we are interested in bringing these claims, but they had some impediment to their own states, whether that was less authority, or I think, as you're mentioning, all of this buildup, whether those were judicial opinions or previous legislation, that actually made it harder to protect their consumers from really tremendous problems that they face. Again, whether that's the growth of monopolies, whether that's the growth of big tech. And one of the things that we did was we actually put out a report talking about what we thought, as the federal regulator, states should do. And one is exactly on point what we were saying, is making sure you're looking at your state unfairness code and making sure it can actually protect against people. And I think from my conversations with people in Colorado, I think there's some confusion about why there are these impediments for individual people to try to hold companies accountable when they break the law. Why is there kind of some arbitrary limitation that if you were ripped off by a company, you would somehow be limited from holding that company accountable? That isn't good for consumers, that isn't good for fair markets, that isn't good for honest businesses. And I think especially now when the federal government has walked away from the fight to protect consumers, making sure that individual people in Colorado can stand up for their rights, can stand up if they get ripped off, is more critical now than ever.
Thank you. Representative Sober.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Frotman, for being here. Appreciate hearing from you. One thing I wanted to point out is our agenda says, this presentation is on the role of states in protecting affordability. I do appreciate being able to hear about the good work of the CFPB. But, in an era where everything is becoming more expensive and we're looking at how to rein in those costs, that also includes government. And that includes what we have to do here in Colorado this year, cut $1.2 billion from our budget. And certainly in trying to rein in those costs, we also don't want to be going back and raising taxes on people, because that just compounds the problem and makes it even worse. And I guess my question for you here is, Colorado has very much an equivalent of the CFPB under the Attorney General's office, and doing very much the same work that the federal office would have been doing. And being respectful of taxpayer dollars, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, why would we replicate those protections and those services when we're also trying to be very much respectful of the taxpayers' dollars and not increase costs on consumers through the form of taxation?
Sure, it's a great question. I think first off, one of the best investments I think we have seen over decades is investment in consumer protection, is investment in antitrust. So where I used to work, the Bureau was able to get back more than $20 billion in restitution for individual citizens, help more than 200 million people get money back on a budget which was a heck of a lot smaller than 200 million. So I think as we think about the challenges that people face, I think consumer protection, making sure that they have a government who could stand up when they get ripped off and cheated, I think is a place where we need to be investing and not looking where to cut. I think in terms of consumer protection, antitrust, fair dealing, I think one of the things that's really important, and we learned this terrible lesson in 2008 and 2009, is that if there are issues and concerns and illegal practices in markets, that quickly takes off and is quickly a national problem, right? The subprime mortgage crisis that blew up the American economy wasn't going to be solved if just Colorado was exceedingly diligent in making sure that their protections were stronger, because as you've seen, many of these are national companies. I think this is more and more as you see the ability that there are no small markets anymore in consumer finance. That's obviously like a little hyperbole, but what's happening in the mortgage market across the border, what's happening in the mortgage market even on the coasts, finds a way to come back here and harm not only your constituents, but your small business owners. And I think the last thing on this, when we were at the federal government, I think what we saw was it really was a partnership. There were issues that were inherently well suited for the CFPB to take because we could have a national lens, we could make sure there was consistency across markets. And then your Attorney General and your Bank Commissioner did a wonderful job on issues that were either local or regional with their AGs. What I have real concerns about is as you start breaking apart the framework where the CFPB has a national lens and they're not doing it anymore, what that means for your state. As the law is articulated, there are things that your Attorney General can't do or your banking regulator can't do. If the CFPB is literally sitting on their hands, that's a tremendous liability for the people here in Colorado.
Thank you. Representative Espinosa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I want to follow up a little bit on my good colleague from Delta's question, and that goes something that you really hadn't talked specifically about in terms of the purpose of the CFPB in addressing the individual claims of citizens. One of the heart-wrenching stories that I heard upon the closure of the CFPB was of a woman who was dying of cancer who had been working for years to try and get her student loans closed and had an appointment set the date that the CFPB was essentially closed. So my question is, in the absence of the CFPB being present, how are those kinds of circumstances for consumers being addressed? And secondarily, what about all the resources that used to exist on the CFPB website that no longer are available for the public? And how do we in Colorado help ensure that we can fill that gap?
Thank you so much for the question. So to give everyone some sense of the excellent question, so one of the things at the heart of the CFPB, all of the big lawsuits kind of get the headlines, but the Bureau has taken more than 10 million complaints from individual consumers, people who are getting run around a bank account, people who are at risk of an illegal foreclosure, people who just wanted to figure out the right amount to pay on their student loans. And every single day the Bureau processed those complaints, got people resolutions, sometimes even just answers. But all of that work also provided a sense to us about what was happening on the ground and what we should focus on. And it's tremendously concerning, and it should be tremendously concerning to all of you, that it appears that the new leadership of the CFPB has broken that tool. And I think as you think about the work that this state needs to do, is understanding where are individual people to go now to get resolution. You guys have a wonderful Attorney General who has focused on consumer issues. how much of that work is going to trickle down? What do they need? I think this goes to the senator's question about what protections do people have over individual accountability if they get ripped off? If the CFPB isn't there to help you get an answer from your credit reporting company or a shady lender or a shady debt collector, unfortunately a lot of that is going to fall to individual plaintiffs, that's going to fall to legal aid, that's going to fall to individual worker and consumer attorneys. And I think it is the exact right question because unfortunately, we're only a month or so into this, and I'm worried this is going to get worse before it gets better. But I think those are the questions to talk to your consumer advocates, your worker advocates, your small business advocates about if the Bureau isn't there to help them, what do they need to hold companies accountable? What do they need to try to create a fair market?
Thank you for your response, Mr. Frotman. Next, I'm going to go to Representative Kelty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Frotman, actually part of my question was kind of on the lines of what Reverend Spinoza asked, almost the same thing. But my second question actually would be, close to your best opinion for the CFPB, why do you believe it was shut down, and what was the reason that they gave you?
Mr. Frotman.
Yes, so it's very confusing in all honesty. The CFPB is quite small. Our budget is under $1 billion, which obviously is real money, but in the grand scheme of things. To my point before, I think we have a track record of delivering more to the American people than we ever spent in our budgets. And it raises all of these questions, some of which I think the Commissioner raised, which is who's to benefit from this? I think one of the concerns you see, which is really concerning, I think, across the board, is you see more and more big tech companies trying to get into payments, create these super apps, where the same companies who have done so much damage on social media want to now overtake our bank accounts. And if the Bureau wasn't there or the Bureau isn't there, those companies are basically able to run roughshod with no oversight, no accountability, and that's really concerning. I know there's been real bipartisan support over kind of the concerns that social media companies have brought into the markets that they have entered. I have little kids who I think are watching. I think we all kind of share those concerns. And I think the idea that you are going to destroy the regulator who's going to oversee big tech's march into consumer finance at the national level is a real bipartisan concern. It's the only real answer that we have been able to come up with, because this isn't about government efficiency. This is like a small agency that's pretty nerdy and wonky and covers this little small piece of the economy. So what is it? Is it really about the idea that people want less oversight over your financial future, your financial freedom? I think is really concerning. I know that I've obviously been grappling with this answer for a couple of weeks now, and that's the best I could come up with.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to turn to Representative Zokai.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Frotman, for being here and giving us some of your time. I'm getting increasingly concerned with the framing that the CFPB or the consumer protection in general is somehow political, and I don't see necessarily a conservative or liberal leaning to supervising big banks or holding predatory payday loans, or I guess as they're called now, earned wage access, accountable. And I'm curious, just your thoughts on that and how the work of the CFPB supports free market.
So it's great, I think, to get out of Washington a lot, so I'm appreciative for you guys to have me, because I totally agree. I think outside the DC Beltway, making sure that people don't get ripped off because they have to take out a student loan for their kids or grandkids to go to school is entirely uncontroversial. Making sure that the mortgage markets never go back to the days when we're making Hollywood blockbusters because they've blown up the global economy, I think is a shared goal. Making sure that when people enter the market with these kind of newfangled products, that they're actually following the law, so reputable institutional players can compete GDP. I think all of this work is just basic middle-class economics. I think one of the things that I've always talked about at the Bureau is the people that I grew up with, weren't buying houses with cash. Like, weren't buying a car with the money they found in cash. And they certainly weren't able to afford sending their kids to school without taking out a loan. These are just American ideals where in the year 2025, people rely on credit and debt to make these happen. And I think most people want to live in a world where if you need to take out a loan to put a roof over your family's head, you're protected from getting ripped off by a bunch of scammers and fraudsters. I think if you want to open a small business, you're protected from someone who's going to give you a terrible product and ensure you never succeed. I think that if you wanted to get a new job, that some employment screening dossier wasn't going to inaccurately think you're someone else and deny you a chance at a better life. And I think the work that you all are doing, I think, is incredibly important to set the stage. These are just the things that we should do to protect our communities, protect our state, and protect our neighbors, because it is definitely true. These should be the most apolitical issues that we deal with.
Good, thank you. Next, I'm going to turn to Representative Bacon.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I want to go back to something I heard you say in response to my other colleagues. You gave the example of perhaps a large social media company now getting into banking. I guess what I'd like to also understand broadly, or what you have also seen in your experience in DC, what protections now still exist, not only in antitrust, but also conflicts? I believe that some of the people who might be working in this area have current contracts with the government. What is keeping any entity from, quite frankly, not running into what we would elsewhere call, conflicts of interest when it comes to either their business growth or access to federal dollars? And what role did your agency have to play in anything like that?
So it's a great question. I think to just be more specific. So as you guys know, you guys exist in the world. The march to digital payments is rapid, and a lot of this happened during COVID. We kind of skipped a whole bunch of generations where what you used to buy with cash, you're now doing online. Even stuff like paying for rent. And so we've seen this tremendous movement towards companies realizing that their big chance to get rich is to enter the payment space. And this is about an opportunity to not only do traditional consumer finance, but it's a way to capture a tremendous amount of personal data. Trying to be able to track everything from what you bought, where you bought it, how much you bought it from. I saw an amazing study that said people are more worried about losing the privacy over their financial data than their health data. And what you see is that there's this tremendous movement for a lot of new players to enter the payment space. So banks have done this for a long time, and now what we would lovingly call non-banks are really getting into the payment space. So these are some smaller companies you never heard of, but then really large companies, like Meta, like Google, like Apple, and increasingly Twitter and X has very big aspirations to basically turn what is a social media account into basically what is a super payments app, where you will spend most of your financial life on X money. So they have been going throughout the country to try to get the necessary state licenses to become money transmitters. And I think the goal is to launch this project by the end of this year. And so how the federal government works is the CFPB is really the only federal regulator who has the ability to oversee non-banks, so people who don't take deposits. So the CFPB is really the primary and only regulator for big tech's entryway into the payment system. And it's really concerning if the Bureau is not doing this work, that basically for the next months or years, it is basically going to be the Wild West for American consumers and businesses, where companies that are basically in charge of making sure there's no fraud or debanking or making sure that just money goes where it's supposed to go is basically going to have no federal oversight. I think to answer your specific question, you can obviously see where this is going. There's tremendous conflicts of interest happening in Washington. So in my role as General Counsel, one of the things that I was in charge of was the ethics program. And Director Chopra was probably the most hardline person to be in all of Washington, D.C. when it came to ethics. And we did stuff to crack down on the revolving door to make sure that all of our T's were crossed and our I's were dotted. And to see basically people who have such a vested interest in the outcome directly involved with the Bureau's work is outlandish. There are criminal ethics conflicts that govern every government employee. I was in charge of things. We would have to refer people to the IG or the Justice Department for stuff that looks so incredibly small to what is happening now. So I think some of this is just legal questions, which is how is it good for anyone to allow companies who have vested financial interests to be involved in the decisions they are making? That is not good for the American legal system. That is not good for anyone's competitor who wants to become involved in payments. And it's certainly not good for customers who are basically living in a world now where the only real